A newborn wildebeest can stand within minutes of being born. Within a day, it can run fast enough to keep pace with the herd, an adaptation essential for survival in an environment saturated with predators for whom a newborn would otherwise be an easy and immediate meal. A newborn human being can do almost nothing. It cannot walk. It cannot feed itself. It cannot regulate its own body temperature effectively. It cannot escape from danger. It cannot even hold its own head up without support. For the first year of life, a human infant is almost completely dependent on adult caregivers for every aspect of its survival, and this profound dependency does not end after the first year. It extends, in gradually diminishing but still substantial form, for well over a decade, longer than the entire lifespan of many mammals. This is strange. From an evolutionary standpoint, an extended period of complete helplessness should be an enormous liability. Every day of childhood is a day in which a young organism is vulnerable to predation, disease, accident, and the failure of its caregivers to provide adequately for its needs. Every year spent not reproducing is a year in which the individual's genes are not being passed on to the next generation. A species that could reach reproductive maturity faster, that could produce offspring capable of fending for themselves sooner, would seem to have an enormous competitive advantage over a species burdened with a decade or more of expensive, dependent, vulnerable childhood. And yet human childhood is, by a considerable margin, the longest and most elaborately extended period of juvenile dependency in the entire animal kingdom relative to total lifespan. Understanding why requires understanding one of the most important and most counterintuitive insights in the evolutionary science of human development: that childhood is not a cost that evolution merely tolerated in service of some other benefit. Childhood is itself the adaptation. It is one of the primary reasons the human species became what it is. Let's begin with the basic biological facts. The evolutionary anthropologist Barry Bogin at Loughborough University, whose research has done more than perhaps anyone's to establish the evolutionary study of human growth as a distinct scientific field, has documented that the human life course contains a developmental stage that is genuinely unique among primates and, as far as the evidence indicates, among all mammals. A distinct period he calls childhood, occurring between infancy and what he calls the juvenile period, characterized by a growth pattern found in no other primate species. Bogin's framework divides human development into 5 distinct stages. Infancy, characterized by nursing and rapid growth. Childhood, a period from roughly age 3 to 7 characterized by continued dependency on adults for food, but the beginning of self-locomotion and increasingly sophisticated learning. The juvenile period, from roughly 7 to puberty, characterized by increasing self-sufficiency, but continued sexual immaturity. Adolescence, the period surrounding puberty, and adulthood. Bogin's key finding is that the childhood and juvenile stages, taken together, represent an evolutionarily novel elongation of the developmental period found in no other primate, including our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees. Chimpanzees, humanity's nearest evolutionary cousins, nurse for several years and then transition relatively directly into a juvenile period in which they are largely self-sufficient in terms of feeding themselves, followed by the onset of sexual maturity in the early teenage years by human reckoning. There is no extended period, comparable to human childhood, during which the young chimpanzee is weaned from nursing but remains substantially dependent on adults for food, while its brain continues to develop at a dramatically accelerated rate. This distinctively human childhood period is expensive. Bogin has calculated that human children, across the childhood and juvenile periods, consume significantly more calories relative to what they produce than the offspring of any other primate species, and that this caloric deficit must be covered by the provisioning efforts of parents and other group members over a period of many years. The evolutionary puzzle is why natural selection would favor a developmental pattern that imposes such an extended and expensive burden on parents and other caregivers. The answer that has emerged from several decades of research converges on what researchers call the brain-body growth trade-off, and it begins with the extraordinary size and metabolic cost of the human brain. The human brain, at full adult size, consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy budget, while representing only about 2% of total body mass, a ratio dramatically higher than any other primate and higher than almost any other mammal. This metabolic cost is not simply a feature of the adult brain. It is present from birth and increases substantially during the early years of childhood, as the brain undergoes the most rapid and extensive period of its development, including the proliferation of neural connections, the process of synaptic pruning through which unnecessary connections are eliminated, and the process of myelination through which neural pathways become insulated and more efficient. The evolutionary biologist Christopher Kuzawa at Northwestern University conducted a landmark study using positron emission tomography to directly measure brain glucose consumption across childhood development, and found that the human brain's metabolic demands peak not at birth and not in adulthood, but at approximately 5 years of age, when the brain consumes an extraordinary 66% of the body's total resting metabolic rate. Kuzawa's research found that this peak in brain energy consumption corresponds precisely to a period of dramatically slowed body growth. Children's bodies grow more slowly during the years when their brains are consuming the largest proportion of available metabolic resources, as though the body is deliberately redirecting energy away from physical growth and toward brain development during this critical window. This finding provides direct physiological support for the brain-body trade-off hypothesis. Human childhood exists, at least in significant part, because the human brain requires an enormous and sustained metabolic investment during early development, an investment so large that the body cannot simultaneously fund both rapid physical growth and rapid brain development. The extended, slow-growing childhood period is the biological compromise that allows the brain to receive the resources it needs without requiring an impossibly large total caloric investment at any single point in development. But this raises an immediate further question. Why does the human brain require such an extraordinarily extended developmental period in the first place? Why not simply build a large brain more quickly, the way the body of a newborn wildebeest is built quickly enough to permit immediate mobility? The answer that has emerged from research in developmental neuroscience points toward a specific trade-off between brain size at birth and the biomechanics of human birth itself, combined with a deeper trade-off between pre-wired and experience-dependent brain development. The anthropologist Holly Dunsworth at the University of Rhode Island has challenged what had been the standard account of this trade-off, known as the obstetrical dilemma, which proposed that human infants are born in a relatively immature state compared to other primates, because the evolution of bipedal locomotion narrowed the human pelvis in ways that placed a hard constraint on how large an infant's head could be at the time of birth, without making childbirth impossibly dangerous. Dunsworth's research has found that pelvic width is not actually the primary constraint on human gestation length, and that maternal metabolic capacity, the mother's ability to supply sufficient energy to a rapidly growing fetus, may be the more fundamental limiting factor determining when human infants are born relative to their state of neurological development. Regardless of which specific mechanism is primarily responsible, the outcome is well established. Human infants are born in a state of neurological immaturity that is extreme even relative to other primates, sometimes described as secondary altriciality, meaning that although humans evolved from ancestors with more mature newborns, human infants have evolved to be born in a comparatively undeveloped state, with brain development that continues outside the womb at a pace and to an extent unmatched by any other species. Some researchers have gone so far as to argue that human gestation, properly understood in terms of the developmental milestones typically reached before birth in other primates, should be considered to continue for a full year after birth, a period sometimes called the fourth trimester. This extended postnatal brain development is not simply a matter of the brain growing larger. It is, crucially, a matter of the brain being shaped by experience in ways that could not occur inside the womb. The developmental neuroscientist Mark Johnson at the University of Cambridge has documented that human brain development after birth is characterized by extensive experience-dependent plasticity, in which the specific pattern of neural connections that develops is substantially determined by the specific environmental inputs, social interactions, and learning experiences that the infant and child are exposed to, rather than being predetermined by a fixed genetic program. This experience-dependent developmental process is, in an important sense, the entire point of human childhood. A brain that developed to full maturity inside the womb, insulated from the specific social, linguistic, and cultural environment the individual would eventually need to navigate, would arrive in the world with a fixed and inflexible cognitive architecture, well suited to a generic environment, but poorly calibrated to the specific language, social structure, technological toolkit, and cultural knowledge of the particular human society into which it happened to be born. A brain that instead continues to develop for years after birth, shaped substantially by the actual environment and culture the child experiences, arrives at adulthood exquisitely calibrated to the specific demands of the specific social and physical world it will need to navigate for the rest of its life. The anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy at the University of California, Davis, has extended this analysis to argue that human childhood cannot be understood purely as a matter of individual brain development, but must be understood as a fundamentally social and cooperative phenomenon. In her influential work on what she calls cooperative breeding, Hrdy has documented that human child rearing, unlike that of virtually all other great apes, has historically depended on the contributions of caregivers beyond the biological mother, including fathers, grandmothers, older siblings, and unrelated group members, a pattern Hrdy calls alloparenting. Hrdy's research proposes that the extraordinarily expensive and extended human childhood could only have evolved in the context of this cooperative breeding system, because no single mother, working alone, could have provided the caloric and caregiving resources that an extended human childhood requires. The evolution of long human childhood and the evolution of cooperative alloparental child-rearing are, in Hrdy's account, mutually dependent developments. Extended childhood created the need for distributed caregiving, and the availability of distributed caregiving made extended childhood evolutionarily viable. There is a further dimension of this research that connects childhood specifically to the development of play, and it reveals something important about why childhood is not simply a period of passive brain maturation, but an active, behaviorally rich developmental strategy in its own right. The psychologist and play researcher Peter Gray at Boston College has documented that human children, across virtually all cultures studied, engage in substantially more play, and particularly more complex, self-directed social play than the juveniles of any other species. Gray's research proposes that play is not simply a pleasant way for children to pass the time during a developmental period that exists for other reasons. Play is itself one of the primary mechanisms through which the extended human childhood accomplishes its developmental function. Gray distinguishes between several categories of play that appear to serve distinct developmental purposes. Physical play, including rough and tumble play, appears to serve the development of physical coordination, strength assessment, and the ability to regulate aggressive impulses within a safe, low-stakes context. Social play, including cooperative games with rules, appears to serve the development of social negotiation skills, the ability to take another person's perspective, and the capacity to create and follow shared agreements. Pretend play, including the elaborate imaginative scenarios that young children spontaneously construct, appears to serve the development of the capacity for counterfactual thinking, the ability to represent and reason about situations that are not currently true. The developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik at the University of California, Berkeley, has proposed a specific cognitive account of why extended childhood and extensive play are linked, framing human children as being biologically specialized for exploration rather than exploitation, to use terms from the mathematics of decision-making under uncertainty. Gopnik's research draws on computational models of learning that distinguish between exploratory strategies, which prioritize gathering new information even at the cost of efficiency, and exploitative strategies, which prioritize using already available information to maximize immediate outcomes. Gopnik has argued that human childhood represents an evolutionary solution in which the costs of inefficient, exploratory behavior are shifted onto a period of life in which the individual is not yet responsible for its own survival, freeing children to engage in exactly the kind of wide-ranging, apparently purposeless exploration and experimentation, through play, that would be far too costly and dangerous for a reproductively active adult who needs to prioritize efficient exploitation of known resources. The dependent, protected status of childhood in this account is not incidental to children's freedom to play and explore. It is the condition that makes such play and exploration possible. Gopnik's research using computational models of causal learning has found that young children, precisely because they are not yet constrained by the need to act efficiently on their existing beliefs, show a distinctive cognitive flexibility, including a greater willingness to consider improbable causal hypotheses and a greater capacity to update their beliefs rapidly in response to new evidence, compared to adults who tend to rely more heavily on prior expectations and existing causal theories. This cognitive profile, less efficient in the short term, but more exploratory and more capable of genuine belief revision, is precisely what would be predicted if childhood evolved as a protected period for cognitive exploration, rather than simply a period of brain maturation that happens to precede productive adulthood. The anthropologist Michael Tomasello at Duke University, whose work on shared intentionality we examined in an earlier video in this series, has documented that human children engage in a distinctive form of social learning, sometimes called cultural learning, that is not observed in the juveniles of other primate species. Human children do not simply observe and imitate the specific actions of adults, as young chimpanzees do. They engage in what Tomasello calls overimitation, faithfully copying even the causally irrelevant components of an adult's demonstrated behavior, and they show a strong tendency to interpret adult behavior as intentional and purposeful even when the underlying purpose is not immediately obvious. Tomasello's research suggests that this distinctive human pattern of cultural learning, in which children default to trusting and replicating the behavior of knowledgeable adults with high fidelity, is what allows human cultural knowledge, technology, and social practices to accumulate across generations in a way that does not occur in other primate species, where each generation must largely rediscover useful behaviors and technologies independently. The extended period of human childhood on this account is not simply time for individual brain development. It is time specifically allocated for the transmission of an accumulated cultural inheritance, too large and too complex to be encoded genetically, requiring instead a prolonged period of social apprenticeship during which the growing child absorbs the accumulated knowledge of the generations that came before. This connects to the grandmother hypothesis, developed by the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah, which proposes that human female menopause, the cessation of reproductive capacity well before the end of the natural lifespan, evolved because older women who stopped reproducing themselves and instead redirected their effort toward supporting the survival and reproductive success of their grandchildren produced a greater total genetic legacy than women who continued attempting to reproduce into old age. Hawkes' research on the Hadza hunter-gatherers of Tanzania documented that grandmothers make substantial and measurable contributions to the nutritional status and survival of their grandchildren, providing direct empirical support for the idea that the extended human childhood and the presence of post-reproductive grandmothers in human social groups are evolutionarily linked adaptations. The comparative evidence from other long-lived, large-brain species provides an important test of these ideas, because it allows researchers to examine whether the relationship between brain size, extended development, and social learning holds across species, rather than being a peculiarity of the human case alone. The primatologist Carel van Schaik at the University of Zurich has conducted extensive comparative research across primate species, examining the relationship between brain size, developmental period length, and what he calls cultural intelligence, the capacity to acquire skills and knowledge through social learning from others rather than through individual trial and error discovery. Van Schaik's research has found a consistent pattern across primates. Species with larger brains relative to body size show longer developmental periods, and species with longer developmental periods show a greater reliance on socially transmitted knowledge and skill, measured through the documented presence of behavioral traditions that vary between different populations of the same species, in ways that cannot be explained by genetic or environmental differences alone. Orangutans, which have exceptionally long developmental periods for a non-human primate, with offspring remaining with their mothers for 6 to 9 years, show correspondingly rich evidence of socially transmitted behavioral traditions across different wild populations, including population-specific tool use techniques and foraging methods that appear to be learned rather than instinctive. Van Schaik's cultural intelligence hypothesis proposes that the relationship between extended development and cultural learning capacity that we observe most dramatically in humans is not a unique human innovation, but an extreme extension of a general pattern found throughout the primate lineage, in which species facing environments that reward flexible, learned behavioral solutions evolve both larger brains and longer developmental periods to support the acquisition of that flexible behavior. This comparative perspective helps clarify what is genuinely unique about human childhood and what represents an extreme version of a pattern shared with other intelligent social species. Human childhood is not qualitatively different in kind from the extended development seen in other large-brained, socially learning species. It is the most extreme expression of a pattern that becomes evolutionarily favored whenever an environment rewards flexible, culturally transmitted behavioral solutions over fixed, genetically programmed ones. Human beings, more than any other species, live in an environment defined by rapidly changing social structures, technologies, and cultural practices, an environment that places an exceptionally high premium on the capacity to learn from others rather than relying on instinct alone, and the exceptional length of human childhood is the evolutionary response to that exceptional premium. What emerges from this body of research is a picture of human childhood not as an unfortunate byproduct of having a large brain, but as a coordinated evolutionary strategy involving multiple interlocking adaptations, a brain that develops substantially after birth in order to be shaped by experience rather than fixed by genetics alone. A cooperative breeding system involving contributions from fathers, grandmothers, and other group members that makes the caloric burden of extended childhood sustainable, and a developmental sequence carefully calibrated to redirect metabolic resources toward brain development at the specific ages when brain development matters most. Human childhood is, in this account, one of the primary reasons human beings became the kind of creature capable of building complex cultures, transmitting accumulated knowledge across generations, and adapting behaviorally to an extraordinary range of environments and circumstances that no other species has been able to occupy. The years of apparent helplessness are not a cost that the extraordinary human brain merely happened to require. They are the mechanism through which that brain becomes what it eventually becomes, not a generically intelligent organ, but one exquisitely and individually calibrated, through years of embedded experience, to the specific social and physical world each child will actually need to navigate. The newborn wildebeest that can run within hours of birth will never need to learn very much, because almost everything it needs to know is already built into its nervous system by the time it is born. The human infant that can do almost nothing has, ahead of it, more than a decade, during which nearly everything it will ever need to know remains to be learned. That asymmetry between an animal built to know and an animal built to learn is not a difference of degree. It is the difference that made us who we are. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.